Welcome back to the Gentleman's Gazette. Today's video is all about shirt collars, the various different styles, how you can wear them, and what they mean for your outfits. Just like the various other aspects of a dress shirt, whether that be its overall fit, its cuff style, its buttons, and so on, the collar of the shirt also comes in many variations. Speaking of those other aspects of a shirt, if you'd like a broader overview, you can consult our shirt style guide here. The general popularity of different kinds of shirt collar styles can vary to some extent by region. If you're in the United States, for example, or elsewhere in North America, the majority of the dress shirts you own probably have point collars. Meanwhile, if you're in the UK, the fashion lately has been for spread collars. In either case, you might not have actually paid much attention to the collar style. After all, it's just one aspect of the dress shirt. But when you begin to dig deeper into the nuances of classic menswear, you'll find that indeed there are a wide variety of different styles of shirt collar, and they each have their own best uses. So today's video will serve as an overview to all of those different kinds of collar styles and how best to wear them. Before we get into the specific individual styles, however, let's cover a few broad parameters. There are 4 items to cover here: stiffness, height, size, and spread. We'll start here with stiffness. From about the 1820s to the 1930s or so, stiff shirt collars made via the liberal application of starch were the norm. In an era where effective detergents and other laundering techniques were not widely available to the masses, most of these collars were detachable from the body of the shirt so that they could be replaced more easily. Reminders of these detachable styles still do exist, particularly with two-tone shirts like the Winchester, which also serve as a reminder to the origins of the white collar for upper-class jobs and blue collar for labor jobs dichotomy that existed in those centuries. Today, though, collar stiffness is usually determined not so much by the amount of starch on the collar, but rather the thickness of the fused or glued interlining present in many collars, but not all. Influential figures in menswear history like the Duke of Windsor, and overall style movements like the Neapolitan style more broadly, have meant that soft collars have become more of the norm today. If you prefer sport coats that have natural and unpadded shoulders, for example, these softer collars help to harmonize with that style detail and continue this overall Neapolitan feel. Overall, soft collars are more casual as well, so they work well in warm weather and more relaxed situations. Conversely, if you're wearing a formal business suit, a stiffer collar is probably going to give you a more professional appearance. And of course, something in between those two, with more of a medium stiffness, is going to be your most versatile option. You won't be able to select your own collar stiffness when buying shirts off the rack, but if you go the made-to-measure or indeed the full bespoke route, choosing your collar stiffness is usually something you'll be able to do. Next, we'll cover collar height, which is the measure of how high the collar sits on your neck. This is measured from the fold of the collar down to the point. When choosing a shirt, especially for the workplace, be aware of the impression that collar height can make. For example, a higher collar is more assertive overall and gives the idea that you're in a position of power. By the way, if you'd like to know more about dressing well for various work environments, you can find our video on that subject here. Higher collars generally are more typical of Italian style, and if they're exceptionally high, they can sometimes even require 2 collar buttons to support that added height. Also, be aware that they may take some getting used to as to how they feel on your neck. If you're interested in trying a taller than average collar, you can look to some brands like Proper Cloth and Eaton. Related to collar height, then, is overall size. Some collars can be quite large and command attention, whereas others can be more small and minimalist. Collars at either of these two size extremes are more rakish and non-conformist, so something in the middle would again be more appropriate for business. Outside of the office, though, if you would like to experiment a little bit more, one way that you can determine what your ideal collar size would be is by looking at your face shape. For example, if you happen to have a large head or a particularly round face, wearing a larger collar to balance this out would be a good choice. If you were to wear an exceptionally small collar here, it would only make your head look larger in comparison. Other than the overall size of one's head, there are a variety of specific face shapes. If you'd like to learn more about these, you can find the second part in our eyeglasses guide for that information. That video is available here. Our fourth and final overall parameter to cover here is collar spread, essentially the distance between the 2 points of the collar. In general, the wider the spread of a collar, the more aggressive the feel of the overall look. Face shape can again come into play here. If you've got a particularly thin or narrow face, wearing a collar with just a bit of spread may be helpful, as wearing something with an exceptionally long point might just make your face look thinner. Conversely, for wide and round faces, wearing something with a bit more of an elongated point to it will help to slim down your face. In general, then, it will be a safe bet if your overall collar size is working similarly to the width of your face, whereas the collar spread can work somewhat in opposition to it. So, with our broad parameters out of the way, let's now get into covering the specific different styles of collar you're going to encounter on dress shirts. We'll start with the point collar, which is also sometimes known as the classic collar. Especially in North America, the default or standard collar type for most dress shirts is likely the point collar. It's called such because the ends of the collar have a slight point to them. The spread between the collar points is generally fairly small, in the range of about 1.5 to 3.5 inches. So, if you happen to be wearing a smaller tie knot, like the 4-in-hand for example, the part of the tie that loops around your neck will not be exposed. By the way, we've previously done a video on specifically pairing different kinds of shirt collars and tie knots together. You can find that one here. Also, in the case of most point collars, the points will not be covered by the lapel or collar of the jacket, as the collar won't have enough length to it. Given that this collar style usually lies in the middle of each of the 4 parameters we've outlined above, it's flattering to a wide variety of face shapes. In particular, men with wider faces benefit well from a point collar. In terms of stiffness, something in the middle does work best for a point collar, as if it's too stiff, the collar points may stand away from the body of the shirt somewhat, especially when a tie is worn. A variation on the point collar is the so-called spear collar, which features essentially the same styling except for the fact that the points of the collar are much longer. This style of collar was popular in the early to mid-20th century, particularly the 1940s, but it's also experienced a bit of a comeback lately. This is because it can be worn in most of the same situations as a standard point collar, but the visual difference is just enough that there's an element of uniqueness there. Retailers with more vintage-inspired offerings are often good places to find spear collars. For example, Edward Sexton sells a range of shirts whose point collars are narrow enough that they do become spears. Another more vintage option, in the same spread range as the point collar but also with its own unique look, is the tab collar. This style features fabric tabs that are sewn onto the undersides of each collar leaf and that attach to the top button of the shirt. This will pull the tips of the collar closer together while also pushing the tie knot out a bit. Essentially, it's doing the work of a collar bar, but more on that in a moment. A word of caution that this collar style can really only be worn with a necktie, as otherwise the tabs would be openly visible and probably just wouldn't look quite right. Continuing on with vintage-inspired collars with relatively narrow spreads, next up is the club collar. This style originated at Eton College, which was an incubator of the stylistic innovations made famous by dandy Beau Brummel. The young men attending Eton were looking for a way to distinguish themselves from men of other schools and hit upon rounding off the points of their shirt collars. This is the defining characteristic of the club collar. And given that their defining features are not mutually exclusive, it's possible to find club collars that are also tab collars. Any shirt collar style with a relatively narrow distance between its points lends itself to the use of a collar clip, bar, or pin. These are accessories designed to bring the collar closer together and elevate the tie knot. If the shirt's collar is designed with special holes in its leaves, it can be used with either a collar pin, which somewhat resembles a large safety pin, or a collar bar, which essentially looks like a barbell with one end that unscrews. Retailers like Eaton and Edward Sexton will sell these special types of pin collars, and they're almost never going to have a wide spread because this way the implement can more easily do the job of drawing the collar together and elevating the tie knot. So long as the spread of the collar is relatively narrow, other styles can also simulate this look via the use of a collar clip. This style of accessory will typically just use tension or hinged joints to hold the collar together so that you don't have to puncture a hole in it with a pin or have holes sewn in for use with a barbell style. Similarly to cufflinks, collar pins are a bit of man jewelry that was popular in the 20th century but has faded a bit today. If you wear a collar pin, clip, or bar, you will stand out a little bit and command more attention. And as you might have guessed, Fort Belvedere offers collar clips, pins, and bars in silver, gold, and rose gold finishes for you to take a look at. You can do so in our shop here. Next up is a bit of an obscure collar, the square collar. These are typically smaller collars with the points nearly at right angles, so they do seem squared off. They were popular as a detachable style in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but they're particularly hard to find today. From an obscure collar, we move to an especially popular one, the button-down collar. Although it originated on the polo fields of England, this collar style became an American favorite after it was introduced by Brooks Brothers. Oxford cloth button-down shirts are staples of Ivy, trad, and prep styles, and we've done videos on all of these, which you can find here. Most often, these collars will be styled similarly to a standard point, with the exception, of course, that the points of the collar button down to the shirt itself. It's an inherently more casual style than a standard point collar would be, but in today's casual world, you'll still look smart if you wear one, especially with a more casual style of jacket, perhaps in something like a tweed. Fans of Italian sprezzatura will even leave one or both of the buttons unfastened for an especially casual appearance. You've got to be especially confident in your own personal style to pull this off, however, otherwise it may just look sloppy, careless, or contrived. Collar stiffness can vary here, with some button-down collars being longer and softer to create more of a collar roll, and others being shorter and firmer to create less of a roll. A more recent variant on the button-down collar essentially contains 2 layers on each collar point. The bottom layer will fasten to the body of the shirt with buttons, and the top layer will look like a standard point collar to hide those buttons. Next up, let's widen the distance between the points of the collar and talk about the spread collar style. As we noted previously, this has become something of the default style for British and European business wear, and it's typically worn with slightly wider tie knots like a half Windsor. However, there are some spread collars where the spread is minimized to an extent, so smaller knots like the 4-in-hand can still be worn without exposing the part of the tie that loops around the neck. Spread collars are also good for accommodating thicker ties, such as ones made from wool or cashmere. A distance of 4 inches or so will often be considered semi-spread, and something in the 5 to 6 inch range would be more along the lines of a full spread collar. Looking at it in terms of angles created by the collar points, typically a spread collar will feature points of 45 degrees or wider. If a spread collar features particularly obtuse angles or a distance of over 6 inches, it becomes a sub-style known as the cutaway collar. And going even further than this is the so-called extreme cutaway style, where the points of the collar actually angle backward toward the neckband. This style of collar is favored in Italian and particularly Neapolitan dressing, and it can be an especially aggressive look. If you're wearing a cutaway or extreme cutaway, having a particularly wide tie knot to complement it is essential. In fact, extreme cutaway collars are often best worn tieless, as the accompanying knot would have to be so large as to almost look clownish. If we were to take the idea of the cutaway collar to its furthest extreme, this would mean that the collar points would go so far back as to disappear altogether. This style, then, is known as the band collar. Band collars will typically stand about 1 to 2 inches high, and they can also be known as a mandarin collar given their origins in Chinese clothing. They can, however, also be seen as part of a particularly rustic American style. Related styles would include the high stand collar of the Nehru jacket and the tightly pointed Mao collar of the Zhongshan suit. As you might imagine, these styles are almost always worn tieless, as the part of the tie looping around the neck would be permanently exposed. Also among these minimalist collars is the one reserved for only the most formal of events, the wing collar. This style is characterized by a particularly high stand and small points that stick out somewhat, resembling the wings of a bird. It's most typically worn only with the white tie dress code these days, although men who are going for a more distinctly early 20th century style could also wear it with black tie. By the way, if you'd like to know more about all of the detailed elements of the white tie and black tie dress codes, you can find that information as part of our comprehensive black tie guide on the website here. 2 more types of specialty collars to discuss today, the first of these being the one-piece collar. This style is also sometimes known as the Hollywood or Cooper collar because it was famously worn by actor Gary Cooper. The one-piece collar is exceptionally rare in ready-to-wear shirts. Usually, a collar is constructed from a separate piece of fabric from the rest of the shirt and then sewn on. However, in the case of the one-piece collar, the collar is actually the exact same piece of fabric as the body of the shirt. This reinforces the collar and enables it to stand up in an especially pleasing way, but as you might suspect, it requires a great degree of tailoring skill to construct properly. Because of its structure, the one-piece collar is typically quite tall and features an especially pleasing collar roll. One potential shortcoming, though, if the one-piece collared shirt is worn tieless with the top button undone, the points of the collar can sometimes float up and escape from underneath the collar and lapels of a jacket. If you're wearing a tie, however, there really shouldn't be any issue here. Finally today, we'll cover the pajama collar, also known as a Cuban collar or bowling collar. This collar is divided into 2 parts and lies flat against the body, somewhat resembling the notched lapel of a jacket. This style of collar is exceptionally casual, and as such, it's most commonly seen on garments like pajamas, bowling shirts, or Hawaiian shirts. We mention the style here for the sake of completeness, and also because it has started to make more of an appearance on long-sleeved shirts worn with tailored clothing. Keep in mind also that various different menswear brands may sometimes have proprietary names for their different collar styles. For example, Paul Frederick markets its varsity collar, Proper Cloth has the Roma spread collar, and you could also see the Martus collar from the now defunct retailer Welch and Margetson. Whatever a proprietary name may be, know that by examining the details of the collar, you will be able to determine which of the types we've laid out here today said collar falls into. As far as choosing a collar is concerned, be aware that something that lies in the middle of the broad parameters we discussed at the beginning will probably be most appropriate for office wear. However, there are also other considerations, such as what tie knot you may be wearing and your face shape. As such, here's one more reminder to take a look at our videos on pairing tie knots and shirt collars, and our overall shirt style guide here. In today's video, I'm wearing a blue and white striped shirt from Charles Tyrwhitt that has a point collar, which they refer to as a classic collar. I've accented it with a gold collar clip from Fort Belvedere, which is also serving to accentuate the knot of my tie. The tie in question is a cashmere wool model in a grenadine weave, featuring wide stripes in orange and gray, accented by a thin stripe in white. I've echoed these orange tones, as well as the blue of my blazer with its gold buttons, by the use of one of our newer pocket square models from Fort Belvedere. Its principal color is sapphire blue, and it features an Art Deco Egyptian scarab design, with other colors being burnt orange, yellow, madder blue, and a teal contrast edge. Also from Fort Belvedere today are my red exotic Caribbean boutonniere, my gold-plated sterling silver eagle claw cufflinks with tiger's eye as the stone, and my shadow striped socks in gray and light blue. You can find all of these accessories as well as a wide variety of others in the Fort Belvedere shop here. Rounding out my outfit today are my trousers, which are in plain charcoal gray to harmonize with one of the stripe colors in the tie, and my shoes, which are dark chocolate brown suede penny loafers from Meerman.